Welcome to the quiet past. Today we will talk about the full history of Pompeii and how the city ended. A plaster cast holds the curled form of a child, small hands pressed to a face forever closed. How did a bustling city become a sudden grave? Long before the eruption, Pompeii was a place of small routines. People woke early, fishmongers shouted, bakers slid bread from ovens, children ran along narrow streets. The town sat where fertile land met the rim of the Bay of Naples. The sea drew traders and farmers alike. A river once cut a path near its edge. Hills rose up behind it. Mount Vesuvius stood as a quiet presence. It had a shape people thought of as part of the local skyline. Yet it had been restless across centuries. Small earthquakes reminded residents that the ground was alive. Those tremors were part of the life here. They did not become the whole story. For a long time, the city grew and changed. It absorbed influences. It was never isolated. Pompeii began as a small settlement. People first built simple huts on safe ground. Over time, Greeks and indigenous Samnites shaped local life. By the time Rome reached into Campania, Pompeii had already learned to trade and to make durable goods. Houses became tiled and painted. Shops opened along the main roads. A busy port saw goods move in and out. Public life took shape. Temples rose, markets formed, bathhouses offered heat and social space. The town learned to adopt Roman customs. Streets were laid out in a practical grid in some neighborhoods. Yet the city kept a close feel. Rooms opened onto small courtyards, murals brightened walls, food and wine were present at every table. Small workshops hummed with steady production. Clay amphorae carried oil, wine, and garum, a fish sauce prized across the region. A day here was ordinary in all its parts. There were arguments, weddings, growing families, and quiet chores. People planned for tomorrow. They bought land and goods. They raised children. They kept household gods. At the center of daily life was a simple human pattern. The pattern of returning to a roof at night. The pattern of expecting tomorrow. That expectation is what the city trusted. And yet, beneath those streets, something ancient slept. It was not an idea. It was a mountain. Mount Vesuvius had a history of eruptions. When it stirred, it left signs. Small earthquakes came and went. The population sometimes spoke of strange smells or hot springs. Their world included a dangerous neighbor, but danger can feel distant when morning chores begin. In the house of the baker, flour dusted the floor. In the store of the cloth merchant, bolts of cloth waited for buyers. In the atrium of a home, a family lit a lamp for the lararium, the shrine to the household gods. Outside, children learned to weave baskets and run errands. In one corner of the city, an ox cart leaned against a wall. A wall painting showed a hunter with a net. Art showed daily life in small scenes. The city was full of traces that we still read today. Those traces include a single stark image. During later excavations, archaeologists found voids in compacted ash. When they poured plaster into those hollows, the forms of people emerged. They were curled, sprawled, and paused forever. One cast, a small child, shows hands pressed to the face. That plaster cast of a fallen body became an emblem for the whole event. It raises the question of how ordinary activity turned into sudden death. That is the specific image I ask you to notice now. The cast is a silent witness. The question remains, what happened in the hours when Pompeii ended? The central thread is a plaster cast of a fallen body. The city was not uniform in wealth or form. Some villas sat on hills with terraced gardens. Others were modest homes with single rooms. The Forum served as a heart for official business. Temples marked civic identity. Shops opened onto streets. The theater and amphitheater attracted crowds. Life moved between private and public spaces. Yet the same mountain overlooked all these places. Over years, Vesuvius showed local farmers signs of strain. Fields sometimes warmed unexpectedly. Wells changed taste. Small shocks shook pottery. At times, the horizon glowed with distant fires. People adapted. They reinforced roofs. They moved expensive goods away from the sea during storms. But the mountain kept its particular ways. When it finally moved toward eruption, the mountain did not warn only once. It gave a series of shifting messages. On some mornings, ash dusted the streets like a faint gray snow. On others, the earth quivered and cracked. Some neighbors decided to leave. Others stayed. Many believed the danger would pass. Others packed what they could. Merchants closed their shops. A few men led flocks away. Families argued about whether to go or to wait. That choice separated those who left early from those who remained until later temperatures rose. There was no single moment of clarity. The eruption included many stages. First came the violent blast that pushed material into the sky. Then ash fell for hours. That ash settled on roofs. It made them heavy. In places where roofs could not be cleared quickly, they began to cut through to living space. People moved from room to room. Some climbed to upper floors. Others slipped into cellars seeking shelter. Still, that was not the final danger. A change in the eruption introduced pyroclastic density currents. These were hot, fast-moving flows of gas, ash, and rock. They were far more deadly than falling ash. They moved with a speed that stunned the mind. They burned, crushed, and asphyxiated. For those who had sheltered in interior rooms, the currents arrived like a wave of black air. Many could not see it until it was upon them. They could feel the heat. They could feel breath stop. In the windy corridors and narrow streets, the air filled with dust and darkness. The sun was blotted out. The city lost most of its life within hours. Bodies lay where they fell. Others took shelter under tables or in doorways. Many were caught while trying to flee. Patterns of movement are preserved in ruins. Shoes stand near doorways. Pots sit half-empty on counters. A woman may have clasped a child. A shopkeeper may have clutched money. Those small actions mark panic and care at the end. Archaeologists read these traces as final choices. They ask how people reacted. They compare stories told by survivors in other places. One contemporary witness wrote of darkness and a storm of black ash. The image is vivid, yet the silence that followed was absolute. For nearly 1,700 years, Pompeii slept beneath its blanket. The city was not entirely forgotten. Salvagers passed over the site. Farmers plowed fields above the ruins. But it was not until deeper curiosity and methodical digging began that the city returned to the light. Early excavators dug for treasure. They cut through streets to find marble and frescoes. They had little concern for context. Later archaeologists introduced better care. They noticed that ash preserved shapes. They understood stratigraphy and sequence. In the 19th century, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli developed a method. He poured plaster into cavities left by decomposed bodies. The plaster hardened into casts. These casts made the last moments legible. Suddenly, personal forms appeared like stories frozen in space. The plaster child with hands to its face came into being this way. The casts forced a cultural shift. They made a terrible detail visible. The city's quiet death became human in the mind of later Europeans. As excavations continued, scholars began to read Pompeii as a social archive. Homes revealed food habits, family size, and trade connections. Murals showed fashion and belief. Graffiti showed jokes and complaints. The city spoke with surprising intimacy. The plaster cast resolves the question raised at the start. The cast is not a relic made for spectacle. It is a direct result of chemical and physical processes and of careful archaeological action. When the eruption buried Pompeii, people did not become stone. Their bodies remained as organic matter. Ash and pumice compacted around them. Over decades and centuries, body tissues decayed. That decay left hollows in the hardened ash. When excavators found these voids, they discovered negative spaces shaped by momentary human poses. By pouring liquid plaster into such hollows, they recreated the exact positions of the people who had been there. The child with hands to face is therefore a portrait in absence. It tells of fear and tenderness. It tells of an instant before the end. The larger explanation for the city's disappearance combines geology and fate. The initial column of eruption rose high into the sky. It rained pumice and ash across the town. Structures weakened under the accumulating weight. Later, the eruption produced pyroclastic flows. These were hot and fast. They swept across the landscape. They buried the city in minutes. Heat incinerated some things. Ash preserved others. The result was a complex archive. Streets and buildings froze in place. Human gestures froze with them. Over centuries, memory blurred, but the physical record remained. Excavations revealed shops untouched by later occupation. They found fresh bread in ovens. They found jars sealed by ash. They found bodies in doorways. In the end, the plaster cast resolves our setup anchor by showing exactly how a living pose became a preserved void. It is a final image that makes the past immediate. The city ended through a series of natural forces. Those forces combined speed, heat, and burial. They left behind a silent city. Yet that silence speaks across time. The plaster cast translates a private death into a public memory. It asks us to listen. We return to a plaster cast of a fallen body, and finally understand what it meant. Pompeii is both a caution and a gift. It reminds us how quickly daily life can be altered. It offers an unusually rich view of the ancient world. We see homes, shops, and final gestures. We also see the patience of the land, ash both buried and preserved. The city remains a place for careful study. It asks us to respect human detail. It rewards slow attention. If the image of the plaster child lingers, that is part of its purpose. It brings a face to a faraway event. It asks us to imagine small lives amid great forces. Thank you for listening. Stay with this quiet past a little longer if you wish. Subscribe to The Quiet Past for more gentle histories. Rest now and let the past unfold within the calm of memory. Rest now and let the past unfold within the calm of memory. In the century after Fiorelli, excavation strategies matured further, and so did the stories that Pompeii could tell. Trenches widened into cleared neighborhoods. An atrium here, a baker's oven there, a painted wall still bright with mythic figures. Each element joined the growing narrative of daily life in a Roman town. The city's voice was not only in grand mosaics, but in small domestic traces. A dog collar left by a threshold, a child's toy found beneath a collapsed bed, the faint grease of repeated meals on an earthen jar. These discoveries complicated simple images of the ancient world. Rather than a single, uniform Roman identity, the things unearthed showed a town of mixtures. Freeborn citizens and freedmen, artisan families and wealthy landowners, migrant laborers and shopkeepers who kept relations with places as far away as the eastern Mediterranean and Hispania. Amphorae stamped with foreign names, exotic spices and fish sauces, and the architectural borrowings on display all testified to long-distance exchange. The forum's inscriptions recorded municipal offices and electioneering slogans scratched in haste. The graffiti in narrow streets preserved jokes, quarrels, declarations of love, and even petty insults, remarkably familiar human particulars that collapsed the distance of 2 millennia. Archaeologists learned to read these signs. Specialists in bones, pollen, and seeds revealed diets that shifted with class and season. Bread and olives, pulses and fish, sometimes roasted meat. Animal remains and vegetable residues showed what people fed their families and how local agriculture fit into wider markets. Isotope studies in recent decades traced the origins of certain skeletons, telling of people born beyond Vesuvius's shadow who nonetheless made Pompeii their home. Even the city's pets left a faint biography on the soil. Mosaic floors with footprints in plaster and the patterns worn into stones by generation after generation gave a sense of habitual movement. Where women carried water, where men argued politics, where children chased one another at dusk. Pompeii's urban tapestry was also marked by interruptions and repairs. The earthquake of 62 AD left scars across the town. Cracks were patched, roofs reinforced, projects left incomplete. These repairs suggested a community attempting to return to normal. Shops reopened, new frescoes commissioned, while the ground remained restless. In the years between that tremor and the final explosion, life resumed in fragile rhythms. We can imagine merchants arranging oil jars, schoolboys practicing letters on wax tablets, priests preparing rites at shrines, both public and domestic. Those temporary continuities make the moment of catastrophe all the more poignant. Ordinary time folded suddenly into an extraordinary, violent event. The material splendor of Pompeii had cultural consequences beyond academia. When the first grand finds reached Europe, they fed a hunger for antiquity that reshaped taste. Artists and architects replicated Pompeian motifs. Wealthy travelers redecorated salons with painted friezes and borrowed columns. The colors and forms that survived in situ, preserved by the unique chemistry of the ash, returned to life in new contexts. Literary imaginations were captured as well. Poems, plays, and later novels found in the city's silence a subject both melancholy and instructive, a civilization poised, an urban body whose features could be studied as if in a careful microscope of time. Yet exposure brought new risks. Once an object is taken out of the protectiveness of burial, its chemistry changes. Painted walls once sealed from the air may flake. Fresco pigments may bleach. Wooden furniture, when excavated, can crumble. The modern challenge has been to balance access with preservation. In the 20th and 21st centuries, debates swelled. Should fragile murals be stabilized in place or removed to climate-controlled museums? Should whole houses be left open to tourists or covered and conserved? The scale of visitation itself presented wear. Thousands of footsteps, humid breath, and the small erosions of human presence. In a few places, poor conservation choices of earlier eras accelerated decay. Concrete patches, inappropriate adhesives, and ill-considered restorations required later correction. International attention and funding have oscillated between enthusiasm and alarm. Commissions of architects, conservators, and archaeologists undertook painstaking efforts to shore up roofs, anchor crumbling walls, and divert water. New technologies helped. Laser scanning recorded surfaces in exacting detail. Photogrammetry preserved three-dimensional records, and remote sensing probed what lay beneath streets without wholesale unearthing. Scientific advances in materials analysis guided more sympathetic conservation strategies. At the same time, the site remained alive with the kind of human curiosity that had first set the spade in motion. Scholars returning to old questions with new methods, graduate students trained in conservation techniques, local archaeologists pacing the same alleys as 19th century workers had done. The ethical dimension of these efforts grew clearer. Who has the right to interpret Pompeii's remains? How should the claims of local heritage be balanced against international scholarly interest and tourist economies? What story should be foregrounded? The elite frescoed houses or the modest spaces where ordinary people lived? Multidisciplinary teams worked with community voices to frame narratives that honored the multiplicity within the city. Exhibitions in regional museums began to present lives rather than merely objects, to place names and faces back into fuller contexts, and to consider the afterlives of the dead with sensitivity. Among the more recent inquiries have been attempts to understand the variety of human responses to the eruption. Not everyone in 79 AD acted the same way. Some fled immediately, others sought shelter within sturdy rooms, and still others lingered, perhaps waiting for loved ones or for the tremors of hope to subside. The casting method preserved only those who were suddenly overwhelmed. Other records, burials outside the city, reports in distant towns, stray accounts in Roman letters, remind us that survival and loss were not uniformly distributed. In time, survivors carried stories into the wider Roman world. Those stories would fracture, romanticize, and be reshaped in turn. As a research site, Pompeii has been generous. It has yielded technical knowledge about ancient construction, sanitation, and urban planning. Sophisticated systems for water and drainage, the layout of bakeries and taverns, the zoning of public amenities, and even the management of waste have been reconstructed from stone and clay. These mundane things illuminate how a complex society faced everyday problems and how, under normal conditions, a bustling town functioned. Shelter, food, worship, entertainment, each thread recovered makes the fabric of Roman life less hypothetical and more tactile. The past is never fully captured. New questions recur with every generation that studies the site. Climate change, too, now presses upon the task of preservation. More intense weather threatens exposed ruins. Plant roots pry into ancient mortar. Changing rainfall patterns complicate drainage plans. Those working at Pompeii must always look forward as they look back, anticipating not only scholarly questions, but environmental shifts that will affect what can be conserved for future eyes. Even as the city is managed, it continues to affect how we imagine endings and continuities. There is a strange consolation in a place that preserves both intimate detail and broad catastrophe. It shows that lives, even when truncated, do not vanish without trace. Objects, buildings, and the hollow shapes left by bodies persist to ask questions of descendants many centuries later. Each corridor walked today is layered with histories of excavation, interpretation, and care. In quieter hours, when electric lights are dimmed and the crowds retreat, the stones of Pompeii hold a weight that is not merely archaeological. They hold human choices, small domestic acts, civic ambitions, everyday kindnesses and cruelties that once threaded together into a familiar town. That familiarity makes the city's fate instructive rather than merely illustrative. Scholars continue to study, conservators continue to protect, and visitors continue to listen. The work of understanding and stewardship goes on, and with it, a patient commitment to keep these stories alive for those who will come after us. Beneath all these layers of study lies the mountain itself, Vesuvius, a quiet sentinel for centuries. Sometimes restless with rumble and heat, often keeping its appetite largely hidden. Long before the Romans reimagined the coastline with tiled roofs and colonnaded streets, the slopes hosted fishermen, farmers, and small settlements whose lives were shaped by rich volcanic soil and an unruly horizon. The town that became Pompeii grew from Oscan and Samnite roots into a prosperous municipal center within the Roman orbit. Its prosperity was public and private alike: forums, baths, temples, shops, and houses that alternated between modest courtyards and lavish suites of rooms painted with myth and garden views. Trade came by sea and by road. Artisanal workshops hummed with production. Neighbors left graffiti that jotted jokes, insults, votes, and declarations of love, small human marks that cut across centuries to touch us now. In the decades before the catastrophe, the city bore marks of stress and recovery. An earthquake, traditionally dated to 62 AD, damaged many buildings and public monuments. Repairs were underway in many quarters when the mountain took its fatal turn. Those unfinished works, loose tiles, and temporary scaffolds tell a story of ambition interrupted, of a civic life temporarily disordered, not yet restored to its former steadiness. Such half-completed repairs may have made some structures more vulnerable to the heavy rains of pumice and the forceful surges that followed. On the day the mountain erupted, contemporary sensibilities were stolen and reshaped by raw geological forces. We still rely on a few surviving eyewitness fragments to construct the sequence: a tall column of ash and pumice rising high into the sky, falling back like an unending hailstorm of light stone, roofs bending under weight, dust turning the day into a false night. Those initial falls led many to flee, toward the sea, toward neighboring towns, or simply into what they hoped were safer rooms. Yet, the tragedy did not end with pumice. At a later phase, deadly currents of hot gas and pulverized rock raced down the flanks of Vesuvius, sweeping across the urban grid with terrifying speed and heat. These flows stripped flesh from bone, carbonized wood, and preserved impressions in the thick tuff that fell. The contrast between gradual burial and sudden searing violence is part of why Pompeii appears at once as a frozen day and a dramatic end. Pliny the Younger's letters, written with the calm of a postscripting observer, give us a literary echo of those events, an outsider's portrait of a rescue attempt and of confusion under ash. Archaeology, though, fills in the human particulars that words alone could miss. The bread still warm on makery stones, the amphorae that were never emptied, the private shrines with offerings set aside. The method of filling cavities left by decomposed bodies with plaster, a practice developed in the mid-19th century, translated voids into haunting, three-dimensional traces of posture and clothing folds, of hands raised or curled in final gestures. These casts do not universalize. They insist on variety, some curled, some prone, some embracing companions, each a testament to a last moment of decision. Once buried, Pompeii ceased to be a living city and became a subterranean archive. Centuries of soil, volcanic debris, and human forgetfulness protected frescoes and woodwork from the slow attrition of time and weather. The surrounding countryside, however, did not forget entirely. People reused stones and tended the land above the ruins. Early modern finds, ornamental objects surfacing during construction or agriculture, provoked curiosity and occasionally plunder. It was only in the 18th century, under Bourbon patronage, that systematic exploration began. Excavators cut trenches and corridors into the buried layers and soon revealed streets and house walls that suggested a whole world beneath. Methods were crude by modern standards, but passionate in intent. Every uncovered room was an invitation to imagine a day of antiquity. As the field matured, so did the discipline of archaeology. Mid-19th century reforms emphasized stratigraphy, record-keeping, and an attempt to preserve the integrity of data. The grid system, the numbering of insulae and domus, the cataloging of finds, all of these practices transformed the site from a treasure trove into a structured laboratory for social and material history. That transformation also entailed difficult ethical questions. Collections were displayed across Europe and beyond. Objects left the ground and entered museums that sometimes stripped them of context. Later, as national identities and politics reshaped Italy, Pompeii became a stage for competing narratives about Rome, empire, and modernity. Interpretations oscillated between celebration and critique, sometimes appropriated by those in power to project continuity and strength. Science in recent decades has taken a still more precise and sometimes quieter role. Microarchaeology examines residues invisible to the naked eye, lipids on pottery that reveal what was eaten, phytoliths that tell us about plants grown and imported, and even the chemical signatures that speak of trade routes. Isotope analysis traces where people grew up, revealing mobility patterns and the mingling of populations. Ancient DNA studies, carried out with careful protocols and respect for the remains, have begun to illuminate relationships, diets, and disease. Geophysical surveys map structures still entombed, guiding cautious excavations that balance knowledge with conservation. Conservation itself has become an art of compromise. Once exposed, fresco pigments fade, mortar weakens, and water and vegetation take over. Teams of conservators now operate like modern gardeners of stone, pruning root systems, stabilizing plaster, and testing breathable coverings to shield delicate pigments from direct sunlight and rain. New material science informs treatments, while digital technologies create virtual facsimiles of frescoes and facades that visitors can consult without stressing the original. Photogrammetry, laser scanning, and 3D modeling give scholars and the public replicas that can be rotated, zoomed, and studied without touch. This very accessibility creates tensions. Mass tourism brings both economic benefit and physical strain. The sheer number of feet on ancient paving stones carries wear, while the need for visitor facilities demands planning that does not overshadow the site. Local communities, conservators, and national governments must negotiate priorities. Who will fund maintenance? Who will interpret the past? And how will the benefits of attention be distributed? Increasingly, local voices insist that the story of Pompeii cannot be told as a static spectacle. It must include those living nearby, whose daily lives intersect with tourism, whose ancestors may have tilled fields above the ruins, and who embody the continuity of the landscape. The ethical dimensions extend to how we treat the dead. Display of human casts raises questions about dignity and pedagogy. Some museums and exhibits have moved toward more sensitive presentations, contextualizing remains, avoiding sensationalism, and involving ethical review in decisions about display. Educational programming has shifted from awe alone toward nuance, showing domestic economics, class, gendered spaces, and the ordinary rhythms of labor, alongside the extraordinary images of catastrophe. Looking ahead, the work at Pompeii threads together conservation science, community engagement, and a desire to broaden the stories told. Climate shifts demand adaptive strategies. Digital archiving offers a hedge against loss. Interdisciplinary scholarship opens avenues to voices once marginalized in scholarship. As new tools reveal more subtle traces, the charred seeds in a hearth, the sip patterns on a doorway, the last line of purchasing or a neighbor's graffiti, the city continues to add brushstrokes to a picture that resists finality. In quiet moments, when the day's last tour groups have gone and the warmed air settles back into stone, the place invites another kind of listening. Patient, attentive, and tentative. Archaeologists clean, conservators test, and teachers speak in low tones. Each act is an attempt to steward a past that still changes how we imagine endings and continuities. The story of Pompeii is therefore not closed. It opens with every new question, every careful excavation, and every thoughtful reflection on what it means to steward the past for the future, and every respectful conversation between specialists and the public, leading us gently toward the discoveries yet to come. At dusk, the stones themselves seem to remember the city's long attentions, the smoothing of cartwheels, the gutters worn by feet, the grooves where ropes pulled vessels to shore. Those marks are quieter witnesses than any inscription, but together they shape a sense of how people lived here for centuries. Pompeii did not spring into being as a Roman fantasy. Its story is layered. It sits on older foundations, where Italic people settled beside Greek traders and where Samnite rulers later added their tastes. The encaustic of influences, language, cults, coinage, pottery, was as much a part of daily life as the bread baked in a domestic oven or the amphora sealed with a merchant's stamp. Shopfronts opened onto streets that led to a forum threaded with temples and administrative halls, places where market exchange and ritual rubbed shoulders. In the houses behind the facades were courtyards bright with light, atria that caught rain, and frescoed walls that offered a stage for private meetings, mythic scenes, landscapes, and trompe-l'oeil windows that expanded interior horizons. Public baths carried a steady hum, the amphitheater held spectacle, workshops rang with the sound of metal and clay. Nearby fields produced olives and grapes, and the sea brought fish and trade. Garum, a fermented fish sauce prized across the Mediterranean, left traces on pottery and in accounts. Marble and bronze moved through the same routes that brought exotic fruits, slaves, and fashions. People of different standings and origins lived close together. There were well-to-do households whose mosaics and imported marbles announced wealth, and there were simpler dwellings where families and clients labored and stored goods. Slaves and freedmen worked alongside citizens. Women managed households, engaged in trade, and left graffiti, wry, intimate, often startling in its plainness, on walls that have outlived paper, ink, and voice. Children's footprints can sometimes be seen in ancient mortar. The city's inscriptions, from formal decrees to the scribbles of gamblers and lovers, present a chorus of human smallness and civic routine rather than a single grand narrative. The end came not as a single cinematic instant, but in a sequence that mixed noise and silence, routine and rupture. In the years before the eruption, the earth had already hinted at its restlessness. A major earthquake struck decades earlier, rearranging buildings and unsettling confidence. Repairs, reinforcements, and new construction marked a community adapting to strain. Everyday life continued, weddings, business, religious rites, against that background of memory and repair. When the mountain finally moved, it began by sending down pumice and ash that sifted through the streets and piled against houses. For some, the first phase may have seemed like a prolonged storm, a nuisance to be endured while seeking shelter beneath sturdy roofs. Those who could leave perhaps did, carrying what they could. Others stayed, either by choice or by mischance, gathering in inner rooms, in the shadow of doorways, or running toward the harbor that promised escape. Contemporary accounts that reached us from the bay, most famously a measured, observant letter by a young man who watched from a distance, tell of a strange light in the sky, of tremors, of ships pulling away, and of an uncle who sailed out to help people on shore. Yet these narratives are partial. They frame an event seen from the coast and the sea, not the labyrinth of alleys and courtyards in the city itself. The later phase of the eruption was different. A surge of gas and incandescent ash swept down slopes, a dense murderous flow that moved with terrifying suddenness. In that pressure and heat, organic materials combusted, collapsed roofs trapped spaces, and people and animals who remained were overwhelmed. The air turned toxic. The world became a furnace or a dark cloud depending on where you stood. The force of those flows sealed rooms in minutes, filled streets with debris, and layered the town in compacted material that would, in time, become the protective cover that preserved so much. Burial by catastrophe made an odd sort of immortality. Organic items, wood, clothing, foodstuffs were carbonized rather than erased, and cavities left by decomposed bodies retained shapes in the hardened ash. Centuries later, an excavator pouring plaster into a void revealed the last posture of someone caught in that moment. Hands raised, a face turned away, clothing folded by the movement of breath. Those casts are not spectacle alone. They are mementos clothed in scientific intent, instruments turned toward empathy and caution. They remind us that the archaeological record can be both tender and forensic. Time layered over Pompeii again. Soil settled, vineyards moved across the top, and the fields were plowed by people who knew little of the full town beneath. Occasional finds surfaced and intrigued curious locals and travelers. In the 18th century, a more systematic excavation began, spearheaded by rulers and antiquarians who saw in Pompeii a reservoir of classical forms to be reclaimed for taste and learning. Sculptures and frescoes were unearthed, and whole rooms seemed to step out of the past. Those early digs were enthusiastic and energetic, but often careless by modern standards. Contexts were not always recorded, and excavations sometimes came at the cost of conservation, with robes of plaster and broken fresco edges left vulnerable to the elements. Archaeological practice would shift. In the 19th century, an Italian superintendent developed methods to document, to catalog, and to preserve context. He introduced the technique of filling voids with plaster to capture forms and invested in plans to map the city block by block. Later directors brought systematic recording, stratigraphic sensitivity, and an awareness that Pompeii could be as much a laboratory for social history as an art gallery. Scholars began to ask different questions. Not only which myth a wall painting depicted, but how that painting functioned in daily life. Not merely what a house contained, but what its layout said about privacy, gendered practice, and household labor. The rediscovery also had a cultural echo. The uncovered sculptures and frescoes fired the European imagination, feeding a taste for classical revival that influenced architects, painters, and poets. The shadow of Pompeii reached beyond scholarship into the arts, prompting both reverence and reinterpretation. Over time, however, the flow of tourists and the wear of exposure demanded new balances. Conservation became not merely the task of protecting art, but of managing a living site, one that must accommodate researchers, residents, and visitors while resisting the slow erosion of water, salts, and human presence. In recent decades, new disciplines have joined the effort. Paleobotany reads carbonized seeds. Residue analysis detects what people ate or stored. Ancient DNA illuminates relationships among people and pathogens. And non-invasive geophysics reveals streets yet unopened. Digital reconstructions let a person stroll virtually through a peristyle garden at midnight, and multispectral imaging can tease pigments from faded plaster without a scalpel. At the same time, those advances carry questions about stewardship, access, and the ethics of display. Who decides what is conserved and what is shown? How do we balance curiosity with the obligation to the dead and to descendants who live with the site? Pompeii's lessons are at once local and global. It teaches about the fragility of settlement near active geology, about the ways empires absorb and reshape local life, and about the daily human economy, the shops, the bakeries, the bathhouses that sustain civic existence until disaster intervenes. It offers a mirror to our present, communities that must negotiate tourism and conservation, that must adapt to shifting climates, that must reckon with unequal distributions of benefit and loss. And yet, despite the enormity of what was taken in a single summer of antiquity, Pompeii is not merely a monument to catastrophe. It is a place where ordinary gestures, scraping a plate, scrawling a joke on a wall, lighting a lamp, persist in the mute language of material culture. Each excavation season, each careful consolidation of a fresco, each transcription of a graffito extends a conversation across millennia. The work continues quietly, researchers testing hypotheses, conservators fitting nets and new mortars to fragile walls, citizens and guides recounting what was learned yesterday and what still must be asked tomorrow. The ruined streets yield their secrets slowly, and when they do so in fragments that insist we read them with humility. That patience is the true inheritance of Pompeii, an inheritance that asks us to listen as we look, and to make space for discoveries that will change how we understand the past and ourselves in the years to come. Today, the study of Pompeii balances high technology with patient attention to context and to the people whose lives are written in stone. Ground-penetrating radar and drones map subsurface anomalies in fragile roofs. Laboratory microscopes read the chemical signatures of hearths and lamps. Archivists stitch together 19th-century field notebooks with contemporary databases so that nothing learned is lost. Teams of conservators test breathable mortars, shade delicate pigments, and install subtle scaffolds to let the wind and rain pass without stealing color. At the same time, social scientists listen to local voices, and educators design programs that bring school children into conversation with the site as a neighbor rather than a closed museum piece. New questions produce new kinds of evidence. The carbonized loaves found in ovens and the residue in amphorae speak of daily meals. Pollen trapped in the ash reveals what fruit and herbs grew nearby. The arrangements of vessels and benches in taverns suggest where people preferred to stand or sit. Even the scratches and jokes on plaster, once dismissed as mere graffiti, are now read as small acts of presence, lines that insist people were here, thinking and speaking in ways both familiar and foreign to us. Studies of victims, carried out with respect and stringent ethics, combine osteology and isotopes to suggest origins, ages, and conditions of life without resorting to sensational detail. The narrative that emerges is granular, a city of craftsmen, merchants, slaves, and families, each household tuned to routines that made urban life possible until it could not be maintained any longer. The eruption itself continues to be reframed, where older accounts emphasized a single cataclysm. More nuanced models reconstruct a sequence of events. An initial fall of pumice and lapilli that forced people to seek shelter, followed by rapid, devastating currents that overwhelmed the town. Those refinements do not lessen the human cost. They clarify how fragile networks of communication and escape can be. They also illuminate resilience, neighboring communities, Roman rescue attempts, and the long afterlives of displaced populations that reshaped the region. Preservation will remain a project of choices. Funding priorities, tourism pressures, climate volatility, and the need to integrate local livelihoods into stewardship strategies are not problems with simple technical fixes. They require long-term planning, interdisciplinary collaboration, and a humility about what can be frozen in time. Pompeii asks of us a temperate patience to make careful decisions now, so that material traces of a distant summer continue to teach and to move future generations who walk the same stones. Responsibility for what is left behind belongs to people who think in different registers. Those who draft policy in marble-faced offices. Those who sweep dust from a doorway before morning visitors arrive. Those who catalog a fragment, and those who tell school children a story about a baker or a baker's child. These activities are not separate from each other. They are braided practices that determine whether color will fade into anonymity, or whether a face on a wall will be remembered. In the coming decades, choices about funding, access, and technique will gradually reconfigure what the site offers to the curious and to the scholarly alike. Part of that reconfiguration is technological, but not merely technological. Photogrammetry and 3D modeling create faithful digital doubles that can be explored in classrooms thousands of miles away. Machine learning helps sort pottery sherds and match broken frescoes. Yet none of these tools replaces the slow discipline of close looking, the calculus of conservation that must weigh exposure against protection. In some places, archaeologists are experimenting with seasonal reburials, covering fragile floors with the same earth that buried them long ago, returning a small portion of the city to darkness to be opened again when methods are gentler. Elsewhere, discrete shelters and water management systems attempt to mitigate the more frequent storms and subtle shifts in humidity that climate change now brings. Conservation is increasingly an ethical practice. The decision to display, to cast, to restore, or to leave a wall raw implicates present-day communities, as well as the memory of those who perished in 79 CE. Conversations with residents of the modern town, with guides and hospitality workers, with regional planners, produce solutions better suited to living landscapes than any single expert's prescription. Training programs pair international archaeologists with local conservators, so craft knowledge circulates, not only as instruction but as mutual learning. Students learn to read plaster and bone with the same reverence with which they learn to speak the ancient names of streets. Interpretation will likewise become more capacious. The narrow curiosities of earlier centuries, an obsession with elite villas, an appetite for the exotic, are giving way to narratives that attend to everyday labor, to the mobility of people and goods, to the invisible infrastructures of sanitation and food supply. The graffiti that once amused antiquarians now helps reconstruct networks of friendship and commerce. The small votive objects and the layout of workshops reveal work rhythms as intimate as a heartbeat. Pompeii remains a place of absence and of evidence, of silence that asks to be translated. Its stones continue to teach methods of looking and ways of caring. As new hands learn to read the city's traces, they will also inherit its questions. and the story will go on unfolding into what we have yet to imagine.